Welcome to this presentation on phenomenology. The goal here, as with the other videos in this area of methodologies, is not necessarily to be providing a really in-depth study of each methodology, but rather to give you starting points so that you can recognize it as an approach and begin to consider if you'd like to use it for your type of research. And even if you choose not to use this particular methodology, it's useful to understand it so you can compare and contrast it with other research methodologies you are perhaps more interested in. So, what is phenomenology? Well, at its core, it's the study of lived experience from the perspective of the person living it. You're going to have come across this phrase likely if you've been listening to the TV and radio recently. So this idea of lived experience really emerges from phenomenology itself. The kind of questions we're asking is, what is it like to have had this experience, to have engaged with this phenomenon? For instance, what's it like to be a music student studying at university? Or what's it like to teach a student who has a specific learning need? Or what's it like to regularly play in an orchestra? The goal of the research is to describe the essence of that experience. So by essence, what we're trying to discover is the essential elements that make this experience the experience itself. What are the things, the elements that make it different to other experiences? An aspect of doing this is about uncovering invariant structures. These are the aspects that must be present for this experience to be the experience. So practically what it means is looking for consistent themes or structures that hold true across different people's experience or retelling of related experiences. For instance, every university student studying music is going to have unique details in their stories. But what we're looking for are the invariant structures, the common threads, the things that are consistent across all of the experiences. We're hoping to find core components that appear in every participant's account. These are the invariant structures that constitute the essence of the experience, the things that make the experience, or the phenomena, the phenomena. So let's ask ourselves a question about how we actually do this and also get into some of the theory. Key to understanding phenomenology is that there are two fundamental positions. There are two ways of doing this research, and they rest on two different philosophical ideas around the role of a researcher. So on one side, we have the work of Edmund Husserl. Now, he came up with the idea of epoche, and it's an idea which is defined as bracketing. So, as the quote suggests, the idea here is to understand the experience and come to it with no preconceptions. So he argued that to truly understand someone else's experience, the researcher should come to the understanding as if they were a clean slate. So to do this, he suggested you have to consciously bracket or set aside all of your personal beliefs, theories and assumptions. The goal here as a researcher is to be pure neutral channel for the participant's story. On the opposing side, we have Martin Heidegger, and he challenged this. He came up with the idea of Dasein, which means being in the world. Heidegger argued that we can never be that clean slate, that we're always going to be situated beings who are embedded in a culture, a language and a history. And he argued that we can't simply step outside of ourselves, our existence, and that fundamentally as a researcher we're always going to be interpretive. So we cannot be that clean slate. And so we've got these two different opposing views of what it means to do phenomenological research as a researcher. So as you can see, this leads us to two very specific paths, as we just outlined. We've got Husserl's position, which assumes the researcher is going to set aside their baggage. So let's think about this logically. So if a researcher successfully brackets their assumptions, then that means they're going to act like a neutral scientific observer. It allows the researcher to see the pure phenomenon. or as it appears to the consciousness of the person experiencing it. That's the intention here. The researcher is not adding their own spin. They're not adding their own interpretation. Therefore, the job of the researcher is to describe, not analyze, the fundamental properties. They're essentially asking, what are the essential building blocks of this thing, separate from any particular context or interpretation? Heidegger, he comes at this from an opposite perspective. It starts with the premise that you cannot escape who you are as a researcher. You're always being in the world. And if you accept that, you can never be a neutral observer. And then that also means that you have to accept that research is fundamentally an act of interpretation. The participant is already interpreting their life to tell the researcher about it. So essentially, the participant themselves are not providing raw data. They're telling a story that's already full of meaning for themselves. And then, added to that, the researcher is interpreting that person's interpretation. So they must use their own understanding, their own knowledge and experience to make sense of the story. Therefore, the object of the study is not a pure phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that's drenched in meaning, context, and significance, both from the perspective of the participant and the researcher. So what does this mean in practice? Well, let's use a concrete example. Imagine that we're looking at, let's say, burnout amongst music teachers. So first we have the descriptive approach, which follows Husserl's idea. If you imagine this path, your goal is going to be to find the universal essence of burnout. To do this, you'd rigorously bracket or set aside your own preconceptions as a researcher. So even if you've been a teacher yourself and experienced much of what's being talked about, you're going to ignore that. And you're going to simply focus on the lived experience of the participant. Your central research question would be, what is this experience of burnout? You'd be searching for the core components that are true for all of the teachers you interview, so you can build a picture of a fundamental nature of the phenomenon itself. On the other hand, we have the interpretivist approach, following Heidegger. Now here, you wouldn't try to eliminate your own background as a musician or an educator or your other experiences circling what's being said to you. Rather, you'd acknowledge that you have a personal history and an understanding, and that these are actually resources that help you interpret the teacher's stories more deeply. Your understanding isn't biased to be removed, it's a tool for making sense of the data. So this focus shifts entirely. You're no longer looking for universal essences, but for specific meanings, in this case about burnout. Your research question becomes, what does this experience of burnout mean to this music teacher or these specific teachers in this school? Also accepting the additional interpretation that you're going to apply as a researcher. So you can see there's a really stark difference here. With exactly the same topic, the descriptive approach seeks universally what, while the interpretive approach explores contextual meaning. So let's zoom in now on one of the most widely used approaches when doing phenomenological research. It aligns more with Heidegger, and it's called interpretive phenomenological analysis, or IPA. So the quote at the top of the slide is from Jonathan A. Smith, and he really is kind of a founder of this approach. I'd like on this slide, let's think about our example of music teacher burnout and follow that through. So the first thing we do is focus. So IPA is about how people make sense of significant experience. So for our burnout study, we're not just asking what happened. We're going to be asking the teachers, how do they grapple with this experience? How did they understand it and the meaning that it holds for them and their identity as a musician, as an educator? We're going to be really focused on their personal sense-making process. Next, the teacher is trying to make sense of their burnout And so they are the first interpreter. But then, as we've already discussed with Heidegger, we're going to assume that research itself is an interpretive act. The researcher is trying to make sense as well via their sense making. So this leads to a second level of interpretation. So the first is the participant who's trying to interpret their experience, and then that interpretation is interpreted by the researcher. This gives rise to what's known as the double hermeneutic. Hermeneutic is a fancy word for interpretation, and the double part means there are two layers of interpretation happening: participants and the researchers. Third, and this is really critical to IPA, is that it's highly ideographic, and this is really vital. As the slide says, it's about a deep individual analysis which comes before finding shared themes. This means that you would take a transcript from your initial teacher and you would analyse it in extraordinary detail as an experience on its own. You'd live with that one story, exploring all of its nuances, and you do that with each subsequent individual experience before you attempted to find commonalities or details across them. So this ideographic approach is really why small samples are used. It'd be very rare to see more than sort of 3 to 6 people involved in this type of study, simply because of the sheer depth of analysis that's required for each individual study. So this isn't a limitation, or isn't viewed as a limitation in IPA. Rather, it's viewed as a fundamental feature that allows signature depth. It allows us to go really deep into the story to really get the rich detail that's needed to draw together for meaningful interpretation. So let's think about the research process itself. So first of all, you're going to start with a question. And as the slide suggests, you're going to focus initially on a question circling around a lived experience. So what's it like to experience whatever this thing is? What's it like to experience life as a musician in an orchestra? Or what's it like to experience being a primary music teacher in a school? Next, you're going to have to find participants. And as we've already discussed, typically this is going to be a very small sample, 3, 4, 5 people. And we're going to really value the depth here. The idea here is not to try to generalize, but to dig deeply into individual experience. Third, we're going to get data collection, and this is almost always done through really in-depth, probably semi-structured, what are called semi-structured interviews. So this is not about having a checklist of questions 1 to 10, rather it's about having a guided conversation. And it's designed to get the participants to share their story in their own words in real depth. So you're looking for kind of creating a space for them to give you detailed descriptions of their experiences. Finally, there's going to be a huge amount of data analysis. And this is a systematic process. It's immersive. You're going to be reading and rereading interview transcripts over and over. You're going to be deliberately identifying significant statements, looking for patterns, grouping these ideas into broader themes. The end goal here is to synthesize all of the data into something that's rich, coherent, and descriptive. It's going to capture the essence of the experience. That's what we're after doing. There are a series of different challenges, and again, it depends a little bit upon which version of phenomenological research we're doing. If we're going to be looking at bracketing and assuming that we're not going to be bringing our own personal experiences as a researcher to the interpretation of the data, then clearly we're going to have to think deeply about this bracketing and the notion of bracketing and how we remove our bias. We've got an issue here around validity and rigor. So again, we're obviously not looking for statistical data in that way. We're going to get this through depth of analysis, and potentially also through member checking. But we have an issue here with member checking, which is essentially if the act of research is interpretive, then our interpretation as the researcher is valid, even if that starts to take the research away from or deviates from the experience of the participant potentially. And this is an area of debate, particularly around IPA and the role of member checking. Generalization or generalizability. So obviously we're not looking in terms of universal laws, we're looking at that depth, that richness of the individual idiographic case. But because of that, ethically, like a lot of this type of research, we're dealing with people who are sharing deep stories, they're making themselves vulnerable, there are power relationships going on, and we need to be highly aware of all of those challenges that are there under the surface. Choosing phenomenological research. Obviously, we're looking at deep research in terms of rich experience. We're trying to understand something at a deep level. We're going to be asking questions like, what was it like to be in this situation? We're looking for things that are complex. We're very often going to be dealing with people's emotions, their value systems, those types of things, areas that are poorly understood where we can add a richness of people who've had those experiences. And we're going to be looking at idiographic cases. We're not trying to cover a huge pool of people. That's not our goal. We're looking for one or two examples of people who've had that very strong experience, who could talk powerfully about it, and we could analyze that data. Obviously, given that, we're not looking at this sort of statistical generalizations, and we're not looking at studying systems, we're looking at studying experiences. So it's a very specific type of research, as you can see. Here's a list of reading if you're interested in this type of research. So here's a list of recommended texts, and here are lists of references that I've used for these slides. Hopefully that's given you a good overview of phenomenological research. Said we've scratched the surface a little bit, but we've not dug too deep. If it's an area of research you're interested in, you're going to want to go away and do further research around it and really get into the nuts and bolts of how it works. But hopefully it's given you enough of a background that you can understand it. You can say, actually, this is the type of research I'm interested in, or it's not really what I'm interested in, but it's useful for me to know about it so I can compare it to the other types of research and methodologies that we've been exploring. Anyway, I hope you found it useful, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.